Okay, so this is the first of a series of mini lectures to cover Chapter 14 on the autonomic nervous system. So previously, I believe it was Chapter 9, we covered skeletal muscle, and skeletal muscle fell within the somatic nervous system. And if we remember what skeletal muscle innervation was like, that was all under voluntary control. When we talk about the autonomic nervous system, this is everything that we don't have control over. So it's our involuntary nervous system, also referred to as the general visceral motor system. So what does it consist of? It consists of the motor neurons and what they synapse with, what their effector organs are. So we're talking about smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. So pretty much anything that isn't skeletal muscle is under control of the autonomic nervous system. And it's meant to make adjustments to ensure that we have optimal support for all of our body activities, and that we're able to shunt blood to areas that need it, such as the brain, and adjust our heart rate, blood pressure, and digestive processes. So we do operate this division of our nervous system under subconscious control. So here's an overview. We've seen this picture before. We covered the central nervous system in the previous chapter. Now we're moving on to our autonomic nervous system here. This was skeletal muscle. And our voluntary nervous system. And now we're here to our autonomic nervous system, which is involuntary. We are going to be doing some comparisons between the somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system. So as we get to those topics, I'll kind of brush you back up on the topics that you need to remember. So our autonomic nervous system is broken down further into two subdivisions, and that would be our sympathetic division, which is our fight or flight division, and our parasympathetic division, which is considered our rest and digest division. So let's first compare the autonomic nervous system with the somatic nervous system. Again, this is going to be our involuntary nervous system. And our somatic is our voluntary. So again, we're talking specifically about skeletal muscle here. So let's compare these two divisions. Both have motor fibers, but what they're different in is their effectors. So again, if we're talking about the autonomic nervous system, we're talking about smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. When we talk about the somatic nervous system, we're talking about skeletal muscle. They're also different in their efferent pathways and ganglia. So when we talk about the efferent pathways, which are those that are exiting our central nervous system, so our brain or our spinal cord, and our somatic nervous system, it's a single neuron that's exiting that's going to synapse with our skeletal muscle. We talk about the autonomic nervous system, as we'll see in a little bit. It's a two-chain neuron system. Once it leaves the central nervous system, that original neuron that exited is going to synapse with another neuron, which we call the postganglionic neuron. And again, the target organ responses to neurotransmitters are also different. We talked about the somatic nervous system having acetylcholine being released from the neurotransmitter at the neuromuscular junction. Acetylcholine acting on the skeletal muscle was always stimulatory. When we talk about the autonomic nervous system, the different neurotransmitters can have a stimulatory or inhibitory effect depending on its receptor and its effector organ. So this is kind of what I just mentioned, but I'll go over it again. We talk about the effectors. Our somatic nervous system is going to innervate skeletal muscle. Our autonomic nervous system is going to innervate cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. Pathways, we don't have any ganglion when we talk about the sympathetic nervous system. If you remember, ganglion are collections of cell bodies outside of the central nervous system. So in our peripheral nervous system, we wouldn't have any collections of cell bodies because we don't have any synapses between neurons when we talk about the somatic nervous system, because it's just a single long axon that's going to extend from the spinal or cranial area and synapse directly on the skeletal muscle itself. The axon of a somatic motor neuron is a group A axon. So that means it's thick, has a large diameter, and it's heavily myelinated. The autonomic nervous system, we need a two-chain neuron system. So we're no longer using a single neuron. So the two-chain neuron system, we have terms for each of the two neurons. The one that's actually exiting the central nervous system, we call the preganglionic neuron. The postganglionic neuron would be the neuron that the preganglionic neuron synapses with. And the postganglionic neuron's axon terminal is going to synapse with the effector organ itself. A couple things in general when we talk about preganglionic neurons and postganglionic neurons. The preganglionic neurons are always going to be thin and lightly myelinated. So these would be like group B fibers. The postganglionic neurons, doesn't matter in which division we're talking about, whether it's sympathetic or parasympathetic, all postganglionic axons are going to be non-myelinated. So these would be like group C fibers. And we kind of talked about it earlier, but I'll mention it again. So neurotransmitter effects, when we have our somatic motor neuron releasing acetylcholine, the effect of acetylcholine binding its receptor on the muscle is always going to be stimulatory. For our autonomic nervous system, the neurotransmitter being released from the postganglionic fiber it can either be stimulatory or inhibitory depending on the type of receptor and the neurotransmitter itself. So here's a good general visual of what we're talking about when we're talking about the somatic motor neuron versus the autonomic motor neurons. This is a really good picture for comparison. However, along the way, as we continue through chapter 14, we're going to add much more details to what they have going on here. But just a review, if we're talking about the somatic nervous system, we're talking about innervation of skeletal muscle. We have a group A fiber and a single neuron, and that axon is heavily myelinated. We're always going to release acetylcholine at the junction, and the effect of acetylcholine at its receptor on the skeletal muscle is always going to be stimulatory. When we talk about the autonomic nervous system, we're talking about a two-neuron chain where we have the first neuron in the chain we call the preganglionic neuron, and then the second neuron in the chain we call the postganglionic neuron. The preganglionic neurons of either the parasympathetic or the sympathetic are always going to be lightly myelinated. All postganglionic axons of the autonomic nervous system are always going to be non-myelinated axons. We'll learn in a little bit that all preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine. And the neurotransmitter release from the postganglionic neuron depends on what division of the autonomic nervous system we're in. So if we're in the sympathetic nervous system, the postganglionic axon is going to release norepinephrine. If we're talking about the parasympathetic nervous system, the postganglionic axon is going to release acetylcholine. Later on, we're going to go in and talk a little bit more about the receptors that can be found on the cell body of the postganglionic neurons, as well as those of the effector organs. In either case, the neurotransmitter, whether it's norepinephrine or acetylcholine, acting on its effector organ, its effect can be either stimulatory or inhibitory. We'll also talk a little bit later, it's not as important right now. There is an exception to the two-chain neuron when we talk about the autonomic nervous system, and that's when we have a synapse with the adrenal medulla itself.